So again, to continue the issue of blood rheology, and I was explaining that, and I mentioned and I discussed the issue of that the blood is not a simple fluid. The blood has a knife inside it, and this knife, we call it the Newtonian, non-Newtonian rheology characters. And by non-Newtonian rheology, as I mentioned, it means that it follows the rules of deformation rate dependency, thixotropy, yield stress, and viscoelasticity, and changing viscosity of the blood with changing stress factors put on the blood flow. And I mentioned that the flow or the fluid flow velocity depends on the pressure inside the circulation or inside the blood vessels, as well as on the resistance, which depends on this resistance depends on the geometry of the blood vessel, that is هندسة الوعاء الدموي، يعني طوله وقطره ونصف قطره. It follows geometrical rules which determines the what we call the hemorrheology or the biophysical properties of blood flow. لأن هنا البيوفيزيكال properties of blood flow, you should understand it to understand the pathobiology of what we call hyperviscosity syndromes. That is diseases associated with increased blood viscosity. You have to understand what are the factors affecting the blood flow, what's the most important factor in blood flow, which is blood viscosity, what are the factors affecting the viscosity of the blood, what are the factors affecting the flow velocity. And here we are speaking about fluid flow velocity, and the fluid here is the blood flow velocity, and factors affecting blood flow velocity according to Boissier law. The Boissier law, he put a simple physical law which explains the physical properties and the rules controlling the movement and the velocity of flowing of any fluid inside a container or inside a tube or viscous. So I already mentioned this, and we have to understand that the velocity of the fluid and the velocity of its flow depend on the, as I mentioned, on the pressure and on the resistance, and the resistance depends on the geometry, that is the length and the radius of the tube, and on the fluid viscosity, as I mentioned. Here I come to this blood simply is a shear thinning fluid. It is a shear thinning fluid, and it is a non-Newtonian fluid following the non-Newtonian rheology rules, which means that it's not like other generalized fluids like water or like plasma, which is part of the whole blood. Plasma is Newtonian, but whole blood, or the blood as a whole, because the blood as a whole is formed of, as I mentioned, cellular elements and plasma with its molecules and proteins and etc. etc. The blood as a whole is non-Newtonian because its viscosity varies with the stress put on, and its flow characters varies with different factors and varies with the stress put on the blood in under different conditions, and stress factors which are placed on the blood during its flow in the blood vessels or in the circulation, whether in the microcirculation or in the macrocirculation inside the human body. So this is very important to know that the blood is non-Newtonian fluid, and its viscosity is affected by stress, in contrast to water and other generalized fluids which follow Newtonian rheology rules, and they are not affected by stress, and they resist deformation, and the viscosity is the same, is kept constant under different conditions. It doesn't change. But blood, as I mentioned, it becomes more viscous with less shear rates, as I mentioned, during high velocity conditions inside the blood vessels, as met with during exercise or during high cardiac output states or during the peak of cardiac systole. Here the blood becomes less viscous because there is what we call high shear rate. So blood viscosity is related to the shear rate, and the blood viscosity is very important determinant in the hemorrheology or the blood flow characters. So by this I have explained what is Newtonian and what is non-Newtonian, and I have explained the Boisier law, which explains the factors affecting the fluid flow velocity. Now I will move to another point, which is what are the factors affecting the or the determinants of the blood viscosity as the most important factor in blood flow characters. The most important determinants are the hematocrit values, which depend on the number and the volume of the RBCs or the erythrocytes. The number of erythrocytes and their volume determine the hematocrit. At high hematocrit rates, there will be high viscosity. There will be hyperviscosity, what we call hyperviscosity. So the number one is the hematocrit values. Number two is the the most important factor is the what we call the deformability of cells, especially the erythrocytes. And has been mentioned that the deformability of the erythrocytes and the erythrocytes is the most important cellular element in the blood, which affects the viscosity and the blood rheology characters. Again, erythrocytes is the most important cellular component affecting the viscosity and blood rheology characters through its deformability, because there is what we call deformability and the aggregability of the RBCs. Is the RBC capable of deformable? If it loses deformability, the blood will become more viscous and there will be more vascular resistance, and there will be more propensity to cause problems, including hypercoagulability, because hyperviscosity prompts and promote hypercoagulability and thrombus formation, and it is actually, in fact, one of the causes of hypercoagulability, because clinically there's a difference between the two terms, hypercoagulability and hyperviscosity, although sometimes there is overlap between the two terms clinically speaking. As I mentioned, hyperviscosity can be considered as one of the causes of hypercoagulability, and hyperviscosity promotes a hypercoagulable states, and we all know that one of the features of hypercoagulability of hyperviscosity as a syndrome is thrombus formation. Although the main triad of hyperviscosity is mucosal bleedings, visual troubles, and the neurological manifestations, but still we have also tendency to thrombi, or a condition similar to the hypercoagulability or the thrombophilic states or the prothrombotic states. So hyperviscosity is prothrombotic. You can say like this: it predisposes to thrombosis. So hyperviscosity is related to any condition which causes deformability. Any condition which increases the cellular elements, whether the RBCs or the white BCs or platelets, can cause increased viscosity. So among the causes of increased viscosity is what we call hyperproliferative states affecting the cellular elements of the blood, which come, as we all know, from the bone marrow. They are formed in the bone marrow, as we all know. So when there is a myeloproliferative or lymphoproliferative or any hyperproliferative state affecting the erythroid series or the leukocyte series or the platelet megakaryocytes and thrombocyte series, there will be hyperviscosity. That's why polycythemia is the cause of hyperviscosity, whether primary polycythemia, that's polycythemia rubra vera, and the secondary erythrocytosis or secondary polycythemia, also leukemias, also thrombocytosis, whether primary thrombocytosis, which is a myeloproliferative disorder, or secondary thrombocytosis, that is increasing the number of platelets. All these thrombocytosis, erythrocytosis, leukemias with increase in the amount, in the quantity, or in the number of white BCs, this causes hyperviscosity, hyperproliferative states affecting the marrow and causing increase in the cellular elements. So this is very important. Also, the RBC deformability. Anything which makes the RBC less deformable will increase viscosity. This is exemplified by the spherocytosis and sickle cell disease. So in spherocytosis and sickle cell disease and some other hemoglobinopathies, there is what we call decrease in RBC deformability and hyperviscosity syndrome or